For a very long moment, we all stood in a frozen tableau of hostile indecision. Debs and Recht stared at each other. Deke breathed through his mouth, and I tried to decide whether assisting the fallen woman was technically within my jurisdiction as a bloodspatter analyst. And then there was a clatter at the front door, and I heard a minor commotion behind me. "Shit," a male voice called out quite clearly. "Shit, shit, shit." It was impossible to argue with the general sentiment, but nevertheless I turned around to see if I could gather some specifics. A middle-aged man hurried toward us. He was tall and soft-looking, and had close-cropped gray hair and a matching beard. He slid to one knee beside Mrs. Aldovar and picked up her hand. "Hey, Emily, honey," he said as he patted her hand. "Come on, Em. I have spent my entire career working with first-rate professional investigators, and some of it must have rubbed off on me, because I almost immediately deduced that this had to be Mr. Aldovar, and my sister is no slouch, either, because she had arrived at the same startling conclusion. She managed to rip her gaze away from Recht and looked down to the man on the floor. "Mr. Aldovar," she said. "Come on, honey," he said, hopefully not to Deborah. "Yes, I'm Michael Aldovar." Mrs. Aldovar opened her eyes and wobbled them from side to side. "Michael," she muttered. Deborah knelt down beside them, apparently thinking that conscious parents are more interesting than the fainted kind. "I'm Sergeant Morgan," she said. "I'm investigating your daughter's disappearance." "I don't have any money," he said, and Deborah looked startled for a moment. "I mean, if there's a ransom, or she knows that. Samantha can't think. Has there been any phone call?" Deborah shook her head as if trying to shake water off. "Can you tell me where you've been, sir?" "There was a conference in Raleigh," Mr. Aldovar said. "Medical statistics. I had to. Emily called and said Samantha had been kidnapped." Deborah looked up at Recht and then quickly back to Mr. Aldovar. "It wasn't kidnapping," she said. He didn't move at all for a second, and then he looked directly at Deborah, still holding his wife's hand. "What are you saying?" he said. "Can I talk to you for a moment, sir?" Deborah said. Mr. Aldovar looked away, then down at his wife. "Can we get my wife into a chair or something?" he said. "I mean, is she all right?" "I'm fine," Mrs. Aldovar said. Dexter," Deb said, jerking her head at me. "Get some smelling salts or something. You and Deke help her up." It's always nice to have a question answered, and now I knew. Apparently, it actually was within my jurisdiction to help women who faint at a crime scene. So I squatted down beside Mrs. Aldovar, and Deborah led Mr. Aldovar off to one side. Deke looked at me anxiously, reminding me very much of a large and handsome dog who needs a stick to fetch. "Hey, you got some of that smelling stuff," he said. Apparently, it had become universally accepted that Dexter was the eternal keeper of the smelling salts. I had no idea where that baffling canard had come from, but in truth, I was completely without. Luckily, Mrs. Aldovar apparently was not interested in sniffing anything. She gripped my arm and Deke's and murmured, "Help me up, please," and the two of us heaved her to her feet. I looked around for a horizontal surface uncluttered by law enforcement where we could deposit her, and spotted a dining table complete with chairs in the next room. Mrs. Aldovar did not need a great deal of help getting into the chair. She sat right down, as if she had done the same thing many times before. I looked back into the next room. Special Agent Recht and her generic companion were edging their way toward the door, and Deborah was very carefully not noticing them. She was instead busy chatting with Mr. Aldovar. Angel Battistino relation was standing on the patio, just outside a sliding glass door, dusting the glass for fingerprints, and I knew that just down the hallway, the huge bloodstain still hung on the wall, calling for Dexter. This was my world, the land of violence, gore, and mayhem. Both personally and professionally, this was where I had lived my whole life. But today it had lost the rosy glow that had for so many years kept me enchanted. I did not want to be here, browsing through the residue of someone else's happy frolic, and even more, I did not want to be off on a carefree romp of my own. I needed different vistas today. I had come to the old turf unwillingly, out of duty to Deborah, and now I wanted to go back to my new country, where all was bright and beautiful, the land of Lily Ann. Deborah glanced up at me without any real recognition, and then back to Mr. Aldovar. I was scenery to her, part of what a crime scene looked like, Dexter as background. Enough, it was time for me to leave, to go back to Lily Ann and wonder. And so, without lingering for any awkward farewells, I slid out the door and walked back to my car, where it still sat nestled in by the dumpster. I drove to the hospital in the prelude to evening rush hour, a magical time when everyone on the road felt empowered and entitled to all the lanes at once because they had left work early. And in my past life, I had taken great joy in the sight of so much naked contempt for life. Today it left me cold. These people were endangering others, not something I could tolerate in a world where I would soon be driving Lily Ann to ballet lessons. I drove at a careful 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, which only served to enrage most of the other drivers. They flew past me on both sides, honking and extending their middle fingers, but I held firm to my safe and sane course, and soon I arrived at the hospital without any actual exchange of gunfire. As I came off the elevator on the floor for maternity, I paused for a second, as the faint echo of a whisper rattled off the back wall of Dexter's dark sub-basement. This was where I had almost seen somebody who might have been watching me for some reason, but the thought came out sounding so ludicrous that I could do no more than shake my head and send a distant tut-tut to the passenger. Almost somebody, indeed. I moved on past, turning the corner to the nursery. All my new friends at the nursery window were gone, replaced by a new crop, and Lily Ann, too, was no longer visible on the other side of the glass. I had a moment of crippling disorientation. Where had she gone? But then logic reasserted itself. Of course, it had been several hours. They would not leave her there alone and on display for so long. Lily Ann would be with her mother, feeding and growing closer. I felt a small surge of jealousy. Rita would have this important and intimate bond with the baby that I could never know, a head start on Lily Ann's affections. But happily for all, I heard the soft and mocking chuckle that lives inside, and I had to agree. Come now, Dexter. If you suddenly choose to feel emotions, is breast envy the best one to start with? Your role is just as important, to provide firm and loving guidance on the thorny path through Lily Ann's life. And who better than me, who had lived on the twisted trail, savoring the thorns, and who now wanted nothing more than to help her through the thickets unharmed? Who better, in short, the no longer demented Daddy Dexter? It was all so neat and logical. I had lived the wicked life in order to know how to steer Lily Ann into the light. Everything made sense at last. And although bitter experience has taught me that if everything makes sense you are looking at it wrong, I nevertheless felt great comfort from the notion. There was a plan, a true pattern, and at long last Dexter knew what it was and could actually see his feet on the game board. I knew why I was here. Not to harry the wicked, but to shepherd the pure. Feeling greatly enlightened and uplifted, I walked briskly past the nurse's station and down to Rita's room at the far end of the hall, right where it was supposed to be. Even better, Lily Ann was there, sound asleep on her mother's chest. A large bouquet of roses sat on the bedside table, and all was right with the world. Rita opened her eyes and looked up at me with a tired smile. "Dexter," she said, "where have you been?" "There was an emergency at work," I said, and she looked at me blankly. "Work," she said, and she shook her head. "Dexter, this is your newborn child here." And right on cue, Lily Ann wiggled slightly and then continued sleeping. She did it very well, too. "Yes, I know," I said reassuringly. "It's not, how can you just wander off to work?" she said, and she sounded very peeved in a way I had never heard before. "When your brand new baby is, I mean work. At a time like this." "I'm sorry," I said. "Deborah needed me." "So did I," she said. "I'm really very sorry," I said, and weirdly enough I really was. "I'm very new at this, Rita." She looked at me, shaking her head again. "I'll try to get better," I added hopefully. Rita sighed and closed her eyes. "At least the flowers you sent were nice," she said, and a tiny bell began to ring in the dark backseat of Dexter's wicked wagon. I had not sent any flowers, of course. I was not experienced enough at all the many subtle hypocrisies of married life to think of such a clever ploy. I had not even realized that responding to an emergency at work was wrong, let alone that I needed to apologize with flowers. Of course, Rita had many friends who might have sent them, and I knew several people who were theoretically friends. Even Deborah might have had a moment of sensitivity, unlikely as that seemed. In any case, there was absolutely no reason a few fragrant blossoms should set off any kind of alarm. But they did. They definitely did. A steady, annoying ding-ding-ding of an alarm that very definitely meant all was not what it should be. So I leaned casually over and pretended to sniff the roses, while actually trying to read the accompanying card. Again, there was nothing at all unusual about it, just a small tag that said, "Congratulations" to us, and scribbled in blue ink underneath was, "An admirer." From the same general region that provided the little alarm bell, I heard a soft and wicked chuckle well up. The dark passenger was amused, and no wonder. Dexter is many things, but admirable is not one of the top 10. As far as I knew, I had no admirers. Anyone who really knew me well enough to admire me was theoretically already dead, dissected, and disposed. So who would sign the card like that? I knew enough about humans to know that a friend or family member would sign their own name to make absolutely sure they got credit for the flowers. An ordinary human, in fact, would already have called on the telephone to say, "Did you get my flowers?" I wanted to be sure because they're so expensive. Clearly, no such call had come, since Rita assumed the roses were from me. Just as clearly, there was nothing really threatening about such a minor mystery. So why did I feel small and icy feet walking up the back of my neck? Why was I so certain that some hidden danger threatened me, and therefore Lily Ann? I tried to be logical, which is something I had once been very good at. Of course, I told myself reasonably, it was not merely the anonymous flowers. I also had the alarm from the possible sighting of a potential someone earlier on. And when I added it all up, I realized what I had. A very strong possible maybe something or not, which might or might not be an actual threat or not. Or something, put that way, in clear and logical form. It made perfect sense for me to feel uneasy. Lily Ann was being stalked by an idiot. Me. I spent an hour sitting with Rita and watching Lily Ann sleep, fuss, and feed. Objectively speaking, it was not really a great deal of activity, but it was far more enjoyable and interesting than I would have imagined. I suppose it is no more than a form of egotism to find your own baby so very fascinating. Certainly, I had never found other babies compelling. But whatever it might say about me, I did it now and I liked it. Rita dozed, waking only once when Lily Ann twitched and kicked for a few seconds. And then a few minutes later, Rita frowned, opened her eyes, and looked at the clock on the wall above the door. "The kids," she said. "Yes," I said, watching as Lily Ann reacted to Rita's voice by curling and uncurling one tiny hand. "Dexter, you have to pick up Cody in a store," she said. "At the after-school program." I blinked. It was true. The program closed at 6, and the young women running it began to get very cranky by 1:15. The clock said 10 minutes of 6. I would just make it. "All right," I said, and I stood up, reluctantly tearing myself away from my baby watching. "Bring them back here," Rita said, and she smiled. "They need to meet their new sister." I headed out the door, already imagining the wonderful scene. Cody and Astor stepping softly into the room, their little faces lit up with love and amazement, seeing for the first time the tiny wonder that was Lily Ann. The scene was crystal clear in my mind, rendered with the combined genius of Leonardo da Vinci and Norman Rockwell, and I found myself smiling as I ambled down the hall to the elevator. It was a real smile, too, an actual, unfaked, spontaneous human expression, and surely Cody and Astor would soon be wearing the same fond smile, gazing down at their new sister, and realizing as I had that a life on the dark path was no longer necessary. For Cody and Astor had also been condemned to walk in shadows, monsters like me, flung into the darkness by the savage abuses of their biological father. And I, in my own wicked pride, had promised to steer their little feet onto the hairy path, teaching them to be safe and code-abiding predators, as I was. But surely the coming of Lily Ann had changed all that. They, too, would have to see that everything was new and different. There was no longer any need to slink and slash. And how could I, in this brave new world, even think of helping them spin away into that dreadful abyss of death and delight? I could not. Everything was new now. I would lead them to the light, set their feet on the path to the good life, and they would grow to be decent, upstanding human beings or the best possible imitations. People can change. Wasn't I already changing right before my very own eyes? I had already had an emotion and a real smile. Anything was possible. And so, with a true surge of genuine human confidence that all would soon be rose petals, I drove to the after-school program, which was at a park near our house. The traffic was in full rush hour, homicidal flow, and I had a new insight into what made Miami drivers tick. These people weren't angry, they were anxious. Each one of them had someone waiting for them at home, someone they hadn't seen all miserable workday long. Of course, they got upset if another driver slowed them down. Everyone had a Lily Ann of their own to get home to, and they were understandably eager to get there. It was a dizzying image. For the first time, I felt a real kinship with these people. We were connected, one great ocean of humanity bound together by a common goal. And I found myself humming a pleasant tune and nodding with forgiveness and understanding toward each appraised middle finger that came my way. I made it to the park only a few minutes late, and the young woman standing anxiously at the door gave me a relieved smile as she handed Cody and a store over to me. "Mr. Morgan," she said, already fishing for keys in her purse. "How is Lily Ann is doing very well," I said. "She will be in here finger painting for you in no time." "And Mrs. Morgan," she said, resting comfortably. I said, which must have been the correct cliché because she nodded and smiled again and stuck the key into the door of the building. "All right, kids," she said. "I'll see you both tomorrow. Bye." And she hurried off to her car at the other end of the parking lot from mine. "I'm hungry," Astor said as we approached my car. "When is dinner?" "Pizza," Cody said. "First we're going back to the hospital," I said, "so you can meet your new sister." Astor looked at Cody, and he looked back, and then they both turned to me. "Baby," Cody muttered, shaking his head. He never said more than 2 or 3 words at a time, but his eloquence was astounding. "We want to eat first," Astor said. "Lily Ann is waiting for you," I said. "And your mother. Get in the car." "But we're hungry," Astor said. "Don't you think meeting your new sister is more important?" I said. "No," Cody said. "The baby isn't going anywhere. And it isn't really doing anything except lying there and maybe pooping," Astor said. "We've been sitting in that dumb building for hours and we're hungry. We can get a candy bar at the hospital," I said. "Candy bar?" Astor said, making it sound like I had suggested she eat week-old roadkill. "We want pizza," Cody said. I sighed. Apparently rosy glows were not contagious. "Just get in the car," I said, and with a glance at each other and a surly double stare from me, they did. The drive back to the hospital, theoretically, should have been about the same distance as the trip in from the hospital to the park. But in fact it seemed to be twice as long, since Cody and Astor sat in complete and sullen silence the whole way. Except that, every time we passed a pizza place, Astor would call out, "There's Papa John's," or Cody would say quietly, "Domino's." I had been driving these streets my entire life, but I'd never before realized how completely the entire civilization of Miami is devoted to pizza. The city was littered with the stuff. A lesser man would certainly have weakened and stopped at one of the many pizza parlors, especially since the smell of hot pizza somehow drifted into the car, even with the air conditioning on, and it had been several hours since I had eaten, too. My mouth began to water, and every time one of the kids said, "Pizza Hut," I was sorely tempted to park the car and attack a large with everything. But Lily Ann was waiting, and my will was strong, and so I gritted my teeth and kept to the straight and narrow of Dixie Highway, and soon I was back in the hospital parking lot and trying to herd 2 unwilling children into the building. The foot dragging continued all the way across the parking lot. At one point, Cody even stopped dead and looked around as if he had heard someone call his name, and he was very reluctant to move again, even though he was not yet standing on the sidewalk. "Cody," I said, "move along. You'll get run over." He ignored me. His eyes roved across the rows of parked cars and fixed on one about 50 feet away. "Cody," I said again, and I tried to nudge him along. He shook his head slightly. "Shadow guy," he said. I felt small and prickly feet on my spine and heard a cautious unfolding of dark leathery wings in the distance. Shadow guy was Cody's name for his dark passenger, and although it was untrained, it could not be ignored. I stopped and looked at the small red car that had caught his attention, searching for some clue that might resonate with my own inner sentinel. Someone was half visible through the windshield of the car, reading the New Times, Miami's weekly alternative paper. Whoever it was gave no sign of interest in us, or anything else besides the cover story, an exposé of our city's massage parlors. "That guy is watching us," Astor said. I thought of my earlier alarm and the mysterious bouquet of roses. It was the flowers that decided me. Unless there was a slow-acting nerve toxin in the roses, there was no real threat hovering around me. And while it was possible that the person in the car really was a predator of some kind, this was Miami, after all. I felt no twinge of warning that he was focused on us. "That guy is reading the paper," I said, "and we are standing in the parking lot wasting time. Come on." Cody turned slowly to look at me, an expression of surprised peevishness on his face. I shook my head and pointed at the hospital. The two of them exchanged one of their patented looks and gave me a matching expression that said they were disappointed but not surprised at my substandard performance. Then they turned together and began to walk again toward the hospital door. Cody glanced back at the car 3 times, and finally I did too, but there was nothing to see except a man reading the paper, and eventually we got inside. Dexter is nothing if not a man of his word, and I led them straight to the vending machine for the promised candy bar. But once again, they dropped into sullen silence, staring at the vending machine as if it was some kind of torture device. I began to fidget with impatience, another real human emotion, making 2 of them so far, and I had to say I was not enjoying my transformation to the species. "Come on," I said, "just pick one." "But we don't want one," Astor said. "Would you rather be hungry?" I said. "Rather have pizza," Cody said softly. I could feel my jaw beginning to tighten, but I maintained my icy control and said, "Do you see pizza in this vending machine?" "Mom says that too much candy can make you have diabetes," Astor said, "and too much pizza makes you have high cholesterol," I said through clenched teeth, "and going hungry is actually good for you, so let's forget the candy bar and go upstairs." I held out my hand to them and half turned toward the elevator. "Come on," I said. Astor hesitated, mouth half open, and we stood that way for several long seconds. Then Cody finally said, "Kit Kat," and the spell was broken. I bought Cody his Kit Kat. Astor chose a 3 Musketeers, and at last, after what had seemed as long and painful as major surgery, we all got into the elevator and headed upstairs to see Lily Ann. We made it all the way to Rita's room without a word about pizza or diabetes, which I regarded as a miracle. And in my new human optimism, I actually thought we might get through the door and into Lily Ann's presence. But Astor stopped dead just outside the closed door, and Cody trickled to a halt behind her. "What if we don't like her?" Astor said. I blinked. "Where does this stuff come from? How can you not like her?" I said. "She's a beautiful little baby." "She's your sister." "Half-sister," Cody said softly. "Jenny Baumgarten has a little sister and they fight all the time," Astor said. "You're not going to fight with Lily Ann," I said, appalled at the thought. "She's just a baby." "I don't like babies," Astor said, a stubborn expression growing on her face. "You're going to like this one," I said, and even I was surprised at the tone of firm command in my voice. Astor looked at me uncertainly, and then at her brother, and I took advantage of their hesitation and seized the moment. "Come on," I said. "Inside." I put a hand on each one and herded them both through the doorway. Not much had changed in the tableau. It was still Madonna and child, with Lily Ann lying on her mother, who held her with one arm. Rita opened her eyes sleepily and smiled as we came in, but Lily Ann simply twitched a little and kept sleeping. "Come meet your sister," Rita said. "You both keep saying that," Astor said. She stood there looking peevish, until Cody pushed past her and walked over to stand beside the bed. His head was just about level with Lily Ann's, and he studied her for a long moment with apparent interest. Astor finally dribbled over to stand next to him, seemingly more interested in Cody's reaction than in the baby. We all watched as Cody slowly put a finger out toward Lily Ann and very carefully touched her tiny curled-up fist. "Soft," Cody said, and he stroked her hand gently. Lily Ann opened up her fist, and Cody let her grasp his finger. She closed her hand again, holding on to Cody, and wonder of all, Cody smiled. "She's holding me," he said. "I want to try," Astor said, and she tried to get around him to touch the baby. "Wait your turn," he told her, and she took a half step back and jiggled impatiently until he finally took his finger away from Lily Ann's fist and let Astor have a turn. Astor moved right in to repeat what Cody had done, and she smiled too when Lily Ann clutched her finger, and the 2 of them took turns at this new game for the next 15 minutes, and for a whole half hour, we didn't hear a single word about pizza. I6T was very enjoyable for me to watch the 3 children, my 3 children, bonding with one another. But of course, any child could have told me that, when you are enjoying yourself within sight of a grown-up, it is only a matter of time before the fun ends. And Rita, as the only real grown-up in the room, did not let us down. After a short while, she looked at the clock and then spoke up. "All right," she said, adding the dreaded words, "it's a school night." Cody and Astor exchanged another of their eloquent looks, in which no sound was made but a great deal was said. "Mom," Astor said, "we're playing with our new sister." She said it as if it were in quotation marks, so Rita couldn't possibly object. But Rita was an old hand at the game, and she shook her head. "You can play with Lily Ann more tomorrow," she said. "Right now, Dex, Daddy, has to take you home and put you to bed." They both looked at me as if I had betrayed them, and I shrugged. "At least there's pizza," I said. The kids were nearly as reluctant leaving the hospital as they had been going in, but somehow I managed to herd them out the door and into my car. Rather than repeat the horrors of the trip over and reel from the fumes of pizza all across town, I let a store use my phone to order as we drove, and we had only been home for 10 minutes or so when our dinner was delivered. Cody and a store tore into the pizza as if they hadn't eaten in a month, and I felt lucky to get 2 small slices without losing an arm. After we ate, we watched TV until bedtime, and then plunged into the familiar rituals of brushing teeth, putting on pajamas, and climbing into bed. It was a little bit strange for me to perform the ceremony. I had witnessed it often enough, but Rita had always been the high priestess of bedtime, and stupidly enough, I felt a little anxious that I might do some part of it wrong. But I kept thinking of what Rita had said in the hospital when she had verbally stumbled and called me Dex, Daddy. I truly was Dex Daddy now, and all this was my turf. Soon I would perform the same rites with Lily Ann, guiding her and her siblings through the treacherous shoals of night time and safely into bed, and I found this an oddly comforting thought. In fact, it sustained me all the way up to the time when I finally had Cody and a store tucked in, and I reached for the light switch. "Hey," a store said, "you forgot prayers." I blinked, suddenly very uncomfortable. "I don't know any prayers." "You don't have to say it," she said. "Just listen." I suppose that anyone with even a little bit of self-awareness will eventually feel like a complete hypocrite in the company of children, and this was my time. But I sat down with a very solemn face and listened to the sing-song nonsense they recited every night. I was reasonably sure they didn't believe any of it any more than I did, but it was part of the procedure, and therefore it had to be done, and we all felt better when it was over with. "All right," I said, standing up and turning off the light. "Good night." "Good night, Dexter," a store said. "Night," Cody said softly. In the normal course of things, I would probably sit down on the couch with Rita and watch another hour of television, just for the sake of disguise maintenance. But tonight, there was no need to subject myself to the ordeal of pretending the programs were funny or interesting, so I didn't return to the living room. Instead, I went down the hall to the small room that Rita called my study. I had used it mostly for research connected to my hobby. There was a computer for me to track down those special individuals who deserved my attention, and there was a small closet where I could store a few harmless items like duct tape and 50-pound test fishing line. There was also a small filing cabinet, which I kept locked, that contained a few folders holding notes on prospective playmates, and I sat at my little desk and opened this up. There wasn't a great deal there at the moment. I had 2 possibilities, but due to the press of events, I had not really pursued either of them, and now I wondered if I ever would. I opened a folder and looked inside. There was a murderous pedophile who had twice been released because of a convenient alibi. I was fairly sure I could break the alibi and prove his guilt. Not in the legal sense, of course, but enough to satisfy the strict standards my cop adoptive father, Harry, had poured into me. And there was a club in South Beach that was listed as the last place where several people had been seen before disappearing. Fang, it was called, a truly stupid name for a club. But in addition to the missing persons reports, the club had turned up in a few INS documents. Apparently, they had an alarmingly high rate of turnover in their kitchen staff, and someone at INS suspected the dishwashers were not all running home to Mexico because the Miami water tasted wrong. Illegal immigrants are a wonderfully easy target for predators. Even if they vanish, there is no official complaint. Family, friends, and employers don't dare complain to the police, and so they do vanish, in numbers that no one can really guess, although I believe it is high enough to raise a few eyebrows, even in Miami. And someone at this club was clearly taking advantage of the situation. Probably, I thought, the manager, since he would have to be aware of the turnover. I flipped through my file and found his name, George Kukarov. He lived on Delito Island, a very nice beach address not too far from his club. A handy commute for work and play, balance the books, hire a DJ, kill the dishwasher, and home for dinner. I could practically see it. A lovely setup, so clean and convenient that it almost made me envious. I set down the file for a moment and thought about it. George Kukarov, club manager, killer. It made perfect sense. The kind of sense that got Dexter's inner hound up on point and salivating, whining eagerly, quivering with the need to be out and after the fox. And the passenger fluttered in agreement, stretching its wings with a sultry rustle that said, yes, he is the one. Tonight together, now. I could feel the moonlight coming through the window and pouring through my skin, slicing deep inside me, stirring the dark soup of my center, and making these wonderful thoughts float up to the top. And as the smell of the simmering broth drifted up and out on the night air, I could picture him taped to the table, squirming and curdling with the same sweaty terror he had sautéed from who knows how many, and I could see the happy knife go up. But the thought of Lily Ann drifted in. And now the moonlight was not so bright, and the whisper of the blade faded, and the raven of Dexter's newborn self croaked, nevermore, and the moon went behind the puffy silver cloud of Lily Ann. The knife went back in its sheath, and Dexter came back to his small suburban life, as Kukarov skittered away into freedom and continued wickedness. My dark passenger fought back, of course, and my rational mind sang harmony. Seriously, Dexter, it crooned with oh-so-sweet reason. Could we really let all this predatory frolicking go unchallenged? Let monsters wander through the streets when it is well within our power to stop them in a final and very entertaining way? Could we really and truly ignore the challenge? And I thought again of the promise I had made in the hospital. I would be a better man. No more demon Dexter. I was Dex Daddy now, dedicated to the welfare of Lily Ann and my fledgling family. For the first time, human life seemed rare and valuable, in spite of the fact that there was so much of it. And for the most part, it consistently failed to prove its worth. But I owed it to Lily Ann to change my ways, and I would do it. I stared at the file folder in my lap. It sang softly, seductively, pleading with me to sing along and make lovely music in the moonlight. But no, the grand opera of my brand new child covered it over, overture swelling. And with a firm hand, I fed the folder into the shredder and went to bed. I got to work just a little bit later than usual the next morning, since I had to deliver Cody and a store to school first. In the past, this had always been Rita's task. Now, of course, everything was different. It was year one of the Lily Ann golden epoch. I would be dropping the two older children at school for the foreseeable future, at least until Lily Ann was a little bit older and could safely ride around in a car seat. And if it meant that I no longer got to work with the first Robins of the day, it seemed like a very small sacrifice. The sacrifice seemed slightly larger, however, when I finally got to the office and found that someone other than dutiful Dexter had actually brought in donuts, and they were all gone, leaving only a tattered and stained cardboard box. But who needs donuts when life itself is so sweet? I went to work anyway, with a smile in my heart and a song on my lips. For once there was no frantic call for me to rush off to a crime scene, and I managed to get through a great deal of routine paperwork in the first 90 minutes of the day. I also called Rita, mostly to make sure that Lily Ann was doing well and had not been kidnapped by aliens. And when Rita had reassured me in a sleepy voice that all was well, I told her I would come to visit that afternoon. I ordered some supplies, filed some reports, and got my whole professional life almost entirely squared away. And although that did not quite make up for the donuts, it nonetheless made me feel very pleased with myself. Dexter dislikes disorder. I was still wrapped in my pink cloud of satisfaction a little before 10 o'clock when the phone on my desk rang. I stepped over and picked it up with a cheerful, "Hello, Morgan," and was rewarded with the surly voice of my sister, Deborah. "Where are you?" she said, rather unnecessarily, I thought. If I was talking to her from a phone attached to my desk by a long wire, where would I be? Maybe cell phones really do destroy brain tissue. "I'm right here on the other end of the telephone," I said. "Meet me in the parking lot," she said, and hung up before I could protest. I found Deborah beside her motor pool car. She was leaning impatiently against the hood and scowling at me. So in a fit of strategic brilliance, I decided to attack first. "Why do I have to meet you out here?" I said. "You have a perfectly good office, and it has chairs and air conditioning." She straightened up and reached for her keys. "My office is infested," she said. "With what?" "Deke," she said. "The smarmy, dim-witted son of a bitch won't leave me alone." "He can't leave you alone," I said. "He's your partner. He's making me nuts," she said. "He leans his ass on my desk and just sits there, waiting for me to fall all over him." It was a striking image, Deborah falling up out of her desk chair and all over her new partner, but however vivid the picture, it made no sense to me. "Why would you fall all over your partner?" She shook her head. Maybe you noticed he is like stupid good looking, she said. If you haven't, you're the only one in the entire fucking building, including especially Deke. I had noticed, of course, but I didn't see what his ridiculous good looks had to do with anything under discussion. Okay, I said. I noticed. So what? So he thinks I'm going to throw myself at him like every other chick he's ever met, she said, which is nauseating. He's dumber than a box of rocks. And he sits there on the corner of my desk, flossing his perfect fucking teeth and waiting for me to tell him what to do. And if I have to look at him for 2 seconds longer, I'm going to blow his fucking head off. Get in the car, she said. Deborah had never been one to disguise her real feelings, but even so, this was quite an outburst. And I just stood for a moment and watched her as she climbed into the car and started the engine. She revved it for a moment and then, to make sure I got the message that she was in a hurry, she hit the siren in a brief whoop that startled me out of my reverie and into the passenger seat. Before I even had the door closed, she had put the car in gear, and we were rolling out of the lot and onto the street. I don't think he's following us, I said as she hit the gas hard and accelerated out into traffic. Deborah didn't reply. She simply swerved around a flatbed truck piled high with watermelons and sped away from the station and her partner. Where are we going? I asked, clinging for dear life to the armrest. The school, she said. What school? I asked her, wondering if the roar of the engine had hidden an important part of our conversation. The rich kids' school Samantha Aldovar went to, she said. What's it called? Ransom Everglades. I blinked. It didn't seem like a destination that required this much haste, unless Deborah thought we were late for class. But here we were, hurtling through traffic at a dangerous pace. In any case, it seemed like good news that, if I survived the car trip over there, I would face nothing more life-threatening than a possible spitball. And of course, considering the school's economic and social status, it would almost certainly be a very high-quality spitball, which is always a consolation. So I did no more than grit my teeth and hang on tightly as Deborah raced across town, turned onto Lejeune, and took us into Coconut Grove, a left on US 1, a right on Douglas, and a left on Poinciana to cut through to Main Highway. And we were at the school in what would certainly be record time, if anybody kept track of that sort of thing. We went through the Coral Rock Gate, and a guard stepped out to stop us. Deborah showed her badge, and the guard leaned in to examine it before waving us through. We drove around behind a row of buildings, and parked under a huge old banyan tree in a spot that said reserved for M. Stokes. Deborah shoved the car into park and climbed out, and I followed. We walked down a shaded walkway and into sunlight, and I looked around at what we had all grown up thinking of as the rich kids' school. The buildings were clean and looked new. The grounds were very well kept. The sun shone a little brighter here. The palm fronds swayed just a little more gently. And altogether, it seemed like a very nice day to be a rich kid. The administration building ran sideways across the center of the campus, with a breezeway in the middle, and we stopped at the reception area inside. They had us wait for the assistant something or other. I thought about our assistant principal in middle school. He had been very large, with a Cro-Magnon forehead that looked like a knuckle, and so I was somewhat surprised when a small and elegant woman came in and greeted us. Officers, she said pleasantly. I'm MS Stein. How can I help you? Deborah shook her hand. I need to ask you some questions about one of your students, she said. MS Stein raised an eyebrow to let us know that this was very unusual. The police did not come around asking about her students. Come into my office, she said, and she led us a short way down the hall and into a room with a desk, a chair, and several dozen plaques and photographs on the walls. Sit down, please, MS Stein said, and without even a glance at me, Deborah took the one molded plastic chair opposite the desk, leaving me to look for a spot on the wall free from framed memories so I could at least lean in comfort. All right, MS Stein said. She settled into the chair behind the desk and looked at us with a polite but cool expression. What's this about? Samantha Aldovar is missing, Deborah said. Yes, MS Stein said. We heard, of course. What kind of student is she? Deborah asked. MS Stein frowned. I can't give you her grades or anything like that, she said, but she is a pretty good student. Above average, I would say. Does she have financial aid to come here? Debs asked. That's confidential information, of course, MS Stein said, and Deborah gave her a hard look, but amazingly, MS Stein did not seem to wither. Perhaps she was used to intimidating glares from the wealthy parents. It was clearly an impasse, so I decided to help out. Does she take a lot of teasing from the other kids? I said. You know about money or anything? Ms. Stein glanced at me and gave me a "that's not really funny" half a smile. I take it you think there might be a financial motive for her disappearance, she said. Does she have a boyfriend that you know of? Debs said. I don't really know, Ms. Stein said, and if I did, I'm not at all sure I should tell you. Miss Stern, Debs said. It's Stein, Ms. Stein said. Deborah waved that off. We are not investigating Samantha Aldovar. We're investigating her disappearance. And if you stonewall us, you're keeping us from finding her. I don't really see. We'd like to find her alive, Deborah said, and I was proud of the cold and hard way she said it. Ms. Stein actually turned pale. I don't, she said. The personal stuff, I really don't know. Perhaps I could get one of her friends to talk to you. That would be very helpful, Deborah said. I think she's closest to Tyler Spanos, Ms. Stein said, but I would have to be present. Go get Tyler Spanos, Miss Stein, Deborah said. Ms. Stein bit her lip and stood up, heading out the door without nearly as much cool composure as she did coming in. Deborah settled back in her chair and squirmed a little, as if trying to find a comfortable way to sit in it. There wasn't one. She gave up after a minute and sat up straight, crossing and uncrossing her legs impatiently. My shoulder was sore, and I tried leaning on the other one. Several minutes went by. Deborah looked up at me 2 or 3 times, but neither one of us had anything to say. Finally, we heard voices drifting in through the door, rising in pitch and volume. That lasted for about half a minute, and then there was relative quiet again. And after several long minutes in which Deborah recrossed her legs, and I switched back to leaning on the original shoulder, Ms. Stein hurried back into her office. She was still pale, and she did not look happy. Tyler Spanos didn't come in today, Ms. Stein said, or yesterday, so I called her home. She hesitated as if she were embarrassed, and Deborah had to urge her on. She's sick, Deb said. No, she'd again, Ms. Stein hesitated and chewed on her lip. She was working on a class project with another student, she said at last. They said in order to work on it, they said she's been staying with the other girl. Deborah sat bolt upright. Samantha Aldovar, she said, and it was not a question. Ms. Stein answered it anyway. Yes, she said. That's right. B7 Etween, the laws that any school can call upon to protect its students from official harassment, and the clout that the parents and alumni of a school like Ransom Everglades could muster. It could have been very difficult for us to gather any information on what was now a double disappearance, but the school chose to take the high road and use the crisis as an exercise in community activism. They sat us down in the same office with the cluttered walls, while Ms. Stein hustled around alerting teachers and administrators. I looked around the room and noticed that there were still the same number of chairs. My leaning spot on the wall no longer seemed terribly inviting, but I decided that our significance in the grand scheme of things had gone up several notches when 2 of the school's students turned up missing. And in short, I was now far too important to lean against the wall. And there was, after all, one more perfectly good chair in the room. I had just settled into Ms. Stein's chair when my cell phone rang. I glanced at the screen, which told me that the call was from Rita. I answered. Hello, Dexter. Hi, it's me, she said. That was my first guess, I told her. What? Oh, anyway, listen, she said, which didn't seem necessary since I was. The doctor says I'm ready to come home, so can you come get us? You're what? I said, completely astonished. After all, Lily Ann had just been born yesterday. Ready? She repeated patiently. We're ready to come home. It's much too soon, I said. The doctor says it's not, she said. Dexter, I've done this before. But Lily Ann, she might catch something, or the car seat, I said, and I realized I was so filled with panic at the thought of Lily Ann leaving the safety of the hospital that I was talking like Rita. She's fine, Dexter, and so am I, she said, and we want to come home, so please come pick us up, okay? But Rita, I said. We'll be waiting, she said. Bye. And she hung up before I could come up with any kind of rational reason for why she shouldn't leave the hospital yet. I stared at the phone for a moment, and then the thought of Lily Ann actually outside, in a world full of germs and terrorists, galvanized me into action. I slammed the cell phone into its holster and jumped to my feet. I have to go, I said to my sister. Yeah, I got that, she said. She threw me her car keys. Get back here as fast as you can. I drove south in pure Miami style, which is to say fast, moving smoothly in and out of traffic as if there were no real lanes. I did not usually drive so flamboyantly. I have always felt that, contrary to the true spirit of our city's roads, getting there is just as important as maintaining a forceful image along the way. But the moves came naturally to me. I grew up here, after all, and the current situation seemed to call for all the haste and macho firmness I could muster. What was Rita thinking? And more, how had she persuaded the doctors to go along with it? It made no sense. Lily Ann was tiny, fragile, terribly vulnerable, and to send her out into cold, hard life so quickly seemed to be complete and callous madness. I stopped at home, just long enough to grab the brand-new infant car seat. I had been practicing for weeks, wanting to be perfect with it when the time came. But the time had come too soon, and I found that my fingers, usually so deft, were icy blocks of clumsiness as I tried to fumble it into place with the seat belt. I couldn't get it through the slot in the back of the thing at all. I pushed, pulled, and finally cut my finger on the molded plastic and flung the whole thing down as I sucked at the cut. This was supposed to be safe. How could this protect Lily Ann when it attacked me so aggressively? And even if it worked as it should, and nothing ever did, how could I keep Lily Ann safe in a world like ours, especially so soon after birth? It was madness to send her home now, 1 day old. Typical medical arrogance and indifference. Doctors think they are so smart, and all because they passed organic chemistry. But they don't know everything. They did not see what a father's heart so clearly told me. It was much too soon to fling Lily Ann out and into the cold, cruel world, merely to save a few dollars for the insurance company. This could never end well. I finally got the car seat in place and then rushed on to the hospital. But contrary to my perfectly logical fears, when I arrived, I did not find Rita standing outside the hospital, dodging bullets while Lily Ann played with used syringes in the trash. Instead, Rita was in a wheelchair in the lobby, a tightly wrapped bundle of baby in her arms. She looked up at me with a loose smile when I rushed in and said, "Dexter, hi." That was very fast. "Oh," I said, trying to register the fact that somehow everything was fine. "Well, actually, I was sort of nearby. You're not going to drive us home that fast, are you?" she said. And before I could point out that I would never drive fast with Lily Ann in the car, and in any case I thought she should stay here a little longer, a cheerful and hairy young man hustled over to us and grabbed at the handles on the back of Rita's wheelchair. "Hey, here's Daddy," he said. "You folks ready to go?" "Yes, thank you," Rita said. The young man blinked and then said, "All righty then," and he stomped down to release the wheel brake and began to push Rita toward the door. And since at some point even I have to cooperate with the inevitable, I took a deep and resigned breath and followed along behind. At the car, I took Lily Ann from Rita and placed her carefully in the aggressive car seat. But for some reason, all the practicing I had done with a store's old Cabbage Patch doll did not quite translate to the real baby. Finally, Rita had to help me get Lily Ann properly fastened in place. And so it was a completely helpless, all-thumbs Dexter who finally climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. And with many anxious glances in the mirror to make sure that the car seat had not burst into flames, I nosed the car out of the parking lot and onto the street. "Don't drive too fast," Rita told me. "Yes, dear," I said. I drove slowly home, not slowly enough to risk the heavily armed outrage of my fellow citizens, but within spitting distance of the speed limit. Each blast of a horn, every thump of an overcranked car stereo, seemed new and threatening. And when I stopped at red lights, I found myself glancing anxiously at the nearby cars to see if any automatic weapons were pointed our way. But somehow, miraculously, we got home safely. Undoing the straps of Lily Ann's car seat was not nearly as complicated as fastening them. And in no time at all, I had her and Rita inside the house and comfortably ensconced on the couch. I looked at the two of them, and suddenly everything seemed so different now, because for the first time they were here, at home, and just seeing my new baby in this old setting seemed to underline the fact that life was new and wonderful and fragile. I dawdled shamelessly, soaking it up and reveling in the utter wonder of it all. I touched Lily Ann's toes and ran the back of my finger over her cheeks. They were softer than anything I had ever felt before, and somehow I thought I could smell the pink newness of her right through my fingertips. Rita held the baby and slid into a smiling semidoze as I touched and sniffed and looked, until at last I glanced at the clock and saw how much time had passed. And I remembered that I was here in a borrowed car, whose owner had been known to verbally behead people for far less. "You're sure you're all right?" I asked Rita. She opened her eyes and smiled, The ancient smile Leonardo did so well, mother with wonder child. I've done this before, Dexter, she said. We'll be fine. If you're sure, I said, with a brand new sensitivity that I actually felt. I'm sure, she said, and very reluctantly I left them there. When I got back to the Ransom Everglades campus with Debs's car, I found that she had been assigned a room in an old wooden building with a view of the bay, as a sort of temporary interrogation room. The pagoda, as the building was called, perched on a bluff above the athletic field. It was a rickety, old wooden building that didn't look like it could survive a single summer storm. And yet somehow it had stood long enough to become a historical landmark. Deborah was talking to an exceedingly clean-cut young man when I came in, and she just glanced up at me and nodded without interrupting the boy's response. I settled into the chair next to her. For the rest of the day, both students and faculty came into the rickety old building one at a time to tell us what they knew about Samantha Aldovar and Tyler Spanos. The students we saw were all bright, attractive, and polite, and the teachers all seemed to be smart and dedicated, and I began to appreciate the benefits of a private school education. If only I'd had the opportunity to attend a place like this, who knows what I might have become? Perhaps instead of a mere blood-spatter analyst who slunk away at night to kill without conscience, I could have become a doctor, or a physicist, or even a senator who slunk away at night to kill without conscience. It was terribly sad to think of all my wasted potential. But private education is expensive, and it had been far beyond Harry's means. And even if he could have afforded it, I doubt that Harry would have gone for it. He had always been wary of elitism, and he believed in all of our public institutions, even public school, or perhaps especially public school, since it taught a brand of survival skills he knew we would need. It was clearly a set of skills the two missing girls could have used. By the time Debs and I finished the interviews, around 5:30, we had learned some very interesting things about both of them, but nothing that suggested they could survive in the wilds of Miami without a credit card and an iPhone. Samantha Aldovar remained a little bit of a puzzle, even to those who thought they knew her well. The students were aware that she got financial aid, but it seemed to be no big deal to anybody. They all said she was pleasant, quiet, good at math, and had no boyfriend. No one could think of any reason why she would stage her own disappearance. No one could remember ever seeing her hanging around with any kind of disreputable character, except Tyler Spanos. Tyler was apparently a true wild child, and on the face of things, the friendship between the two girls was extremely unlikely. Where Samantha got a ride to and from school with her mother in a 4-year-old Hyundai, Tyler drove her own car, a Porsche. While Samantha was quiet and shy, Tyler seemed to be the original good-time Charlene, a perpetual loud party just looking for a place to happen. She did not have a boyfriend, only because she could not limit herself to one boy at a time. And yet a close friendship had developed over the last year or so, and the two girls were almost always together at lunch, after school, and on weekends. Not only was this puzzling, it was the one thing that bothered Deborah more than any other. She had calmly listened and asked questions, put out a bolo on Tyler's Porsche, and with a shudder, sent her partner, Deke, to talk to the Spanos family, and none of these things had caused so much as a ripple on the face of the sea of Deborah. But the strange friendship between the two girls had, for some reason, caused her to come up on point like a cocker spaniel sniffing steak. "It makes no fucking sense," she said. "They're teenagers," I reminded her. "They're not supposed to make sense." "Wrong," Deborah said. "Some things always make sense, especially with teenagers. Nerds hang with nerds. Jocks and cheerleaders hang with jocks and cheerleaders. That never changes. Perhaps they have some kind of secret mutual interest," I suggested, glancing casually at my watch, which told me that it was very close to time for me to go home. "I'd bet on it," said Debs, "and I'd bet that if we find it, we find out where they are. Nobody else here seems to know what it might be," I said, even though I was actually trying to construct a graceful exit line. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Deborah said abruptly. "Excuse me. You keep squirming around like you have to pee," she said. "Oh, actually," I said, "it's almost time for me to go. I have to pick up Cody in a store before 6. My sister stared at me for what seemed like a long time. "I never would have believed it," she said at last. "Believed what? That you be married, kids, you know. A family man with all you got going on." And by that, I knew she meant my darker side, my former role as Dexter the Avenger, the lone blade in the moonlight. She had found out about my alter ego and had apparently become reconciled with it, and just in time for me to abandon the persona. Well, I said, I don't suppose I would have believed it either. But I shrugged. Here I am with a family. Yeah, she said, and she looked away. And before me. I watched her face working to rearrange itself back to her usual mask of perpetual grumpy authority, but it took several moments, and in the interval she looked shockingly vulnerable. Do you love her? She said suddenly, swinging back to face me, and I blinked with surprise. Such a blunt and personal question was very unlike Deborah, which was one reason we got along so well. Do you love Rita? She repeated, leaving me no wiggle room whatsoever. I don't know, I answered carefully. I'm used to her. Deborah stared and then shook her head. Used to her, she said, like she's an easy chair or something. Not that easy, I said, trying to inject a little levity into what had suddenly become a very unsettling conversation. Do you even feel love at all? She demanded. I mean, can you? I thought of Lily Ann. Yes, I said, I think so. Deborah watched my face for several long seconds, but there was really not much to see, and she finally turned away and looked out through the old wooden window frame at the bay. Shit, she said. Go home, go get your kids and hang out with your easy-chair wife. I had not been human for very long, but even so, I knew something was not quite right in the land of Deborah, and I could not leave her on that note. Debs, I said, what's wrong? I saw her neck muscles tense, but she continued to look away out over the water. All this family shit, she said, with these two girls and their fucked up families, and your family with fucked up you. It's never what it should be, and it's never right, but everybody gets it except me. She took a deep breath and shook her head, and I really want it. She swung back at me with ferocity, and no goddamn jokes about the biological clock, all right. To be completely honest, which I am when I have to be, I was far too deeply shocked by Deborah's behavior for any jokes, whether about clocks or anything else. But joke or no, I knew I had to say something, and I cast about for the right thing and could only come up with a question about Kyle Chutsky, her live-in boyfriend of several years. I had seen the approach on a daytime drama a few years back. I like to study them for clues on how to act in ordinary situations, and it looked like that was going to pay off here. Is everything okay with Kyle? I said. She snorted, but her face softened. Fucking Chutsky thinks he's too old and beat up and useless for a nice young thing like me. Keeps saying I can do better. And when I say maybe I don't want to do better, he just shakes his head and looks sorrowful. It was all very interesting, a truly riveting look into the life of someone who had been a human being much longer than I had. But I was all out of ideas for constructive commentary, and I felt very much the pressure of the clock, the one on my wrist, not the biological one. So, floundering about for something to say that would be properly comforting, and yet hint at my need for immediate departure, all I could come up with was, well, I'm sure he means well. Deborah stared at me long enough to make me wonder if I had really said the right thing. Then she sighed heavily and turned to face out the window again. Yeah, she said, I'm sure he means well too. And she looked out at the bay and didn't say anything, but, worse than any words she could have uttered, she actually sighed. This was a side of my sister I had not seen before, and it was not a side I wanted to see a great deal more of. I was used to Deborah being full of sound and fury, signifying arm punches. To see her soft and vulnerable and roiling with self-pity was unsettling in the extreme. Even though I knew I should say something comforting, I had no idea where to begin, and so I stood there awkwardly, until finally the need to leave was stronger than my sense of obligation. I'm sorry, Debs, I said, and oddly enough I was. I have to get the kids now. Yeah, she said without turning around. Go get your kids. I said, I need a ride back to my car. She turned slowly away from the window and looked over at the building's door where Ms. Stein was hovering. Then she nodded and stood up. All right, she said, we're done here. She walked past me, paused only to thank Ms. Stein with flat politeness, and led the way back to her car in silence. The silence lasted almost all the way to my car, and it was not very comfortable. I felt like I should say something, lift the mood a bit, but my first two attempts fell so flat that I stopped trying. Debs pulled into the parking lot at work and stopped beside my car, staring straight ahead through the windshield, with the same look of unhappy introspection she'd been wearing for the whole trip. I watched her for a moment, but she didn't look back. All right, I said at last. See you tomorrow. What's it like? she said, and I paused with the door half open. What's what like? I said. When you held your baby for the first time, she said. I didn't have to think very hard to answer that. Amazing, I said. Absolutely wonderful. It's not like anything else in the world. She looked at me, and I couldn't tell whether she was going to hug me or hit me, but she didn't do either, and finally she just shook her head slowly. Go get your kids, she said. I waited for a second to see if she would say anything else, but she didn't. I got out of the car, and as she drove slowly away, I stood and watched, trying to fathom what was going on with my sister. But it was clearly something far too complicated for a newly minted human, so I shrugged it off, got into my car, and went to get Cody and a store. T8 traffic was heavy as I drove south on Old Cutler Road to pick up Cody and a store. But for some reason, everyone seemed to be very polite in this part of town tonight. A man driving a large red Hummer even paused to let me in when the lanes merged, and I had to get over, which I had never seen before. It made me wonder if perhaps terrorists had slipped something into the Miami water system to make us all soft and lovable. First I had resolved to quit my dark ways. Then Debs had thrown a fit of near weeping. And now a Hummer driver in rush hour was polite and thoughtful. Could this be the apocalypse? But I saw no flaming angels on the remainder of the drive to the park, where Cody and a store were interred. And once again, I got there just before 6 o'clock. The same young woman was waiting by the door with Cody and a store, jiggling her keys and practically dancing with impatience. She very nearly flung the children at me. And then, with a mechanical smile that was not in the same league as one of my fakes, she vaulted for her car at the far end of the parking lot. I loaded Cody and a store into the backseat of my car and climbed behind the wheel. They were relatively silent, even a store. And so, in my role of new human father, I decided I should open them up a little bit. Did everybody have a good day? I said with immense synthetic good cheer. Anthony is such an asshole, a store said. A store, you shouldn't use that word. I told her, mildly shocked. Even Mom says that word when she's driving, she said. And anyway, I heard it on the radio in her car. Well, you still shouldn't use it, I said. It's a bad word. You don't have to talk me to like that, she said. I'm 10 years old. That's not old enough to use that word, I said. No matter how I talk to you, so you don't care what Anthony did, she said. You just want to make sure I don't use that word. I took a deep breath and made a special effort not to ram the car in front of me. What did Anthony do? I said. He said I wasn't hot, a store said, because I don't have any boobs. I felt my mouth open and close a few times, all by itself, and just in time I remembered that I still needed to breathe. I was clearly in far over my head, but just as clearly I had to say something. Well, I said quite distinctly. I mean, very few of us do have boobs at 10. He's such a butthead, she said darkly, and then in a very syrupy sweet tone she added, Can I say butthead, Dexter? I opened my mouth again to stammer something or other, but before I could utter a single meaningless syllable, Cody spoke up. Somebody's following us, he said. Out of reflex, I glanced in the rearview mirror. In this traffic, it was impossible for me to tell if somebody was, in fact, following us. Why do you say that, Cody? I asked. How can you tell? In the mirror, I could see him shrug. Shadow guy, he said. I sighed again. First a store with her barrage of forbidden language, and now Cody with his shadow guy. Obviously, I was in for one of those memorable evenings parents have now and then. Cody, the shadow guy can be wrong sometimes, I said. He shook his head. Same car, he said. Same as what? It's the car from the hospital parking lot, a store interpreted. The red one, where you said the guy wasn't looking at us, but he really was. And now he's following us even though you think he isn't. I like to think I am a reasonable man, even in unreasonable situations, like most of those involving kids. But at this point, I felt I had let unreality intrude just a little too far, and a small lesson was called for. Besides, if I was going to follow my resolve to cross over to the sunny side of the street, I had to start weaning them away from their dark imaginations at some point. And this was as good a time as any. All right, I said, let's see if he really is following us. I moved into the left lane and signaled for a turn. Nobody followed us. Do you see anybody? I said. No, a store said, very grumpily. I turned left down a street beside a strip mall. Is anybody following us now? No, said a store. I accelerated down the street and turned right. How about now? I called cheerfully. Anybody behind us? Dexter, a store, grumbled. I pulled over in front of a small and ordinary house much like ours, putting 2 wheels on the grass and my foot on the brake. And now, anybody following us? I said, trying not to gloat audibly at making my point so dramatically. No, a store hissed. Yes, Cody said. I turned around in the seat to scold him and stopped dead, because through the rear window of the car I could see that a few hundred feet away, a car was nosing slowly toward us. There was just enough light from the setting sun to see a quick flash of red color from the small car, and then it was crawling toward us through the shadows of the tree-lined street. And as if awakened by those shadows, the dark passenger carefully uncoiled and spread out its wings and hissed a warning. Without thinking, I stepped down hard on the gas, even before I turned back around to face front, and I left a small patch of torn grass behind me and narrowly missed plowing into a mailbox as I looked forward again. The car skidded slightly as it regained the pavement. Hold on, I told the kids, and with something far too close to panic, I raced down the street and turned right, back toward US 1. I could see the other car behind me, but I was well ahead by the time I got back to the highway, and I turned right quickly into heavy traffic. I began to breathe again, just once or twice, as I powered across 3 lanes of rapidly moving cars and into the far left lane. I gunned it through a light just as it changed to red, and sped up the street for a half-mile before I saw an opening in the oncoming traffic and screeched through a left-hand turn and down another quiet residential street. I drove through 2 intersections and then turned left again, so that I was now running parallel to US 1. The street was dark and quiet, and there was no sign of anything at all behind us now, not even a bicycle. All right, I said. I think we lost him. In the mirror, I saw Cody staring out the back window, and he turned around and caught my eye and nodded. But who was it, Dexter? A store said. Just some random lunatic, I said, with more reassurance in my voice than I actually felt. Some people get off on scaring people they don't even know. Cody frowned. Same guy, he said. From the hospital. You can't know that, I said. Can, he said. It's just a coincidence. 2 different crazy people, I told him. Same, he said dismissively. Cody, I said, but I could feel the adrenaline draining out of me, and I really didn't want an argument, so I let it go at that. He would learn as he grew that the greater Miami area was filled with a varied and impressive collection of wackos and predators, and many that were half of each. There was no way to know why someone had followed us, and it didn't really matter. Whoever it was, they were gone now. Just to play it safe, I continued to drive on the side streets all the way home, in case our follower was watching the highway. Besides, with the sun going down, it was easier to see somebody behind us in darker house-lined streets, away from the bright orange glow of the lights along US 1. And there was nobody to see. Once or twice headlights flared in the rearview mirror, and each time it was simply a homeward-bound commuter, turning down his own street and parking in his driveway. We came finally to the cross street that took us to our own little bungalow. I turned onto it and edged up to US 1 carefully, looking in all directions. There was nothing to see but traffic, and none of it looked sinister. And when the light finally changed to green, I crossed the highway and drove through the 2 more turns that took us to our street. All right, I said, as our little patch of heaven heaved into sight. Let's not say anything about this to your mom. She'll just worry. Okay, Dexter, a store said, and she leaned forward against the back of the front seat, pointing ahead to our house. I slid my gaze along her outstretched arm and hit the brakes hard enough to rattle my teeth. A small red car was parked directly in front of the house, nose pointed at us. The lights were on, and the motor was running, and I could not see inside it. But I did not need to see in order to feel the rapid beat of dark leathery wings and the angry hiss of a wide-awake passenger. Stay here, doors locked, I told the kids, and I handed a store my cell phone. If anything happens, call 911. Can I drive away if you're dead? A store said. Just stay here, I said, and I took a deep breath, gathering the darkness. I can drive, a store said, unsnapping her seat belt and lurching forward. A store, I said sharply, and there was an echo of the other voice, the cold commander in my own. Stay put, I said, and she settled back into her own seat almost meekly. I got out slowly and faced the other car. There was no way to see inside, and no sign of anything dangerous. Just a small red car with the lights on and the engine running. I felt the equivalent of a long drum roll from the passenger, ready for action but no hint of what. It could be flaming chainsaws, It could be a pie in the face. I stepped toward the car, trying to plan what to do, which was impossible because I did not know what they wanted or even who they were. It was no longer believable that it was merely a random crazy. Not if he knew where I lived. But who was it? Who had any reason to act like this? Among the living, I mean. Because there were plenty of former victims who might have loved to come after me. But they were all far beyond any sort of action at all, other than decomposition. I walked forward trying to be ready for everything. Another impossibility. Still no sign of life in the other car. And nothing at all from the passenger, except a puzzled and cautious flutter of wings. And when I was about 10 feet away, the driver's window slithered down, and I stopped in my tracks. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then a face came out the window, a familiar face, wearing a bright fake smile. "Wasn't that fun?" the face said. "When were you going to tell me I'm an uncle?" It was my brother, Brian.